Hi everyone, this is Christelle Estrada, and those who are in the University of Utah PLUSS certification, or if you're anyone else across Utah that would like to sign in, that would be great. We have it archived and recorded as well. So I'm just going to do a review of some of the things that we've done, and then focus on specifically the way in which individual student outcomes in the data reports for separate individual students based on the 4 domains could help you think differently about instruction. So just as a review, our first session, which was the face-to-face, we really focused on assessing the idea of our context in relationship to the TESOL explanations of competency for a candidate who is taking an ESL endorsement, and really thinking about the practical implications related to performance goals that we would write based on assessing our current competency. If you remember, you did it either as a team or in pairs or individually to write your performance goals based on each domain, which always starts with language, in particular the idea of language acquisition, which is specifically very different from literacy, but is a complementary way to think about the way in which language functions in the classroom, which we're going to talk about later on with the WIDA key uses. Also culture, and in the culture domains, if you look at it, the value is looking at diversity in relationship to assets, and then what those assets would bring to our own ideas that focus either on implicit bias or uncover those assumptions that shape the way in which we create educational opportunities for students who are learning English. The third domain is planning, implementing, and managing instruction. Now, these are 3 really key processes and skills. Remember, a skill is just a way to become more knowledgeable in relationship to how you design instruction based on who the learners are and what their needs are. And that leads us right to the issue of assessment, which includes the idea of self-assessment and goal setting that individual students can do based on their individual student reports in the data gateway. And then the last one, domain 5, focuses on professionalism. Professionalism at many levels focuses on how we work with colleagues at the grade level, in our departments at the secondary level, within our communities of practice, and specifically how we engage parents in meaningful experiences so that they're not only knowledgeable, but they can address issues related to the quality of instruction that English learners deserve. And then the 5th one was looking at each goal under the meets or exceed standard for all the rubrics in those domains, and then identifying lines of evidence that can be used to demonstrate your own competency. So this is a really concrete way to develop your own individualized learning plan, just as if you were experiencing what it would mean for students to identify their own competency and use lines of evidence to demonstrate whether they can show their growth and their competency, specifically related to the goals that they developed for themselves and the evidence they're using. In the first session, I used my example, and it's aligned to the USBE goals in the Utah Performance Management System. I picked Domain 5, or professionalism, focused on Standard B, 5B, which is partnerships and advocacy. And the performance indicator is fairly clear. It says serve as professional resources personnel in their educational communities. And then there are descriptors related to candidates helping other teachers, schools, administrators working effectively with students. And my goal, I've actually changed it. Originally, it was about writing blogs on the UEN website. we've finally developed the UEN, Utah's Promising Practices website. So that's where the resources are for thinking differently about supporting families and communities and the impact that has on children. So I specifically changed my goal based on what I was actually doing in my practice. If you look at the next one, it's about providing instruction and professional growth activities for colleagues. So I organized this so it's focused on the people that I work with here in teaching and learning. Specifically, it says department at 4 monthly staff meetings designed to identify skill-based approaches to content instruction. I'm adjusting this again because it probably will be more like two meetings, monthly meetings. One will be I'm scheduled for February, and then maybe in May. The reason this is important is the new USBE team that does Title III monitoring visits is now established across the agency. So I will actually adjust this in relationship to the work that we're doing in monitoring classroom instruction based on the feedback that we got on the ESSA Title III plan from the Department of Education that asked the question, how is the state agency ensuring the kind of technical assistance and feedback, and technical assistance, in other words, is multiple forms of providing resources so that English learners have access to grade level content in the subject areas of mathematics, science, and English language arts. So I'm adapting that, changing it from 2 monthly staff meetings to the work that we've done with Canyons District as well as Salt Lake District and individual charter schools in monitoring classroom instruction. At the last meeting in October, the face-to-face meeting, I got great feedback on a tool that we're using for observations. I'm going to bring those tools back to the February meeting to get more feedback and to adjust and give you kind of a breakdown of the things that we've actually discovered by using this tool for observing. Collaborate strategically with the ALS directors to design and support necessary to respond to state legislators' requests for a statewide EL plan that they will support. So I've adjusted this because in the next week there's going to be the release of the 2018 school report card and the implications for the state accountability for 10 English learners at every school and what that actually looks like for state accountability, not just federal accountability. And I'm connecting this kind of work with webinars for technical assistance in the new grants management system, where the feedback from the monitoring visits is uploaded into the monitoring function of the grants management system, and then used to help LEAs better assess the effectiveness of language program for English learners based on the outcomes for English learners. So that's how I've adjusted my goals. And the reason I'm using that example is I want you to be able to, as you continue learning with your own learning plan, that you begin to adjust your goals in relationship to what you're doing specifically. So it's not something in the abstract, but it's what you're actually doing. In the October meeting, we looked at the program standards and the goals and the evidence and had conversations around this in relationship to what, every participant was learning about themselves as a teacher and the community and parents. We actually did look at the continuum for Bixen Kelp that I did in the previous webinar to look at identifying practices that supported that continuum from basic interpersonal communications to the more challenging academic teaching, academic conversations, and academic English in the content areas. We didn't get to the using the individual student reports, which I'm actually going to do this time. I think I handed them out, and then I said that we'd spend more time on it. But what we did do is we used a tuning protocol, and we used it with one volunteer. And the tuning protocol is a process where the educator, based on the redesign of their instruction and what they're working on as evidence for to show their competency, would end up getting feedback in a way that's a safe learning environment, and that based on the question that focuses on the kind of feedback that they want. Now, the thing that's important about this is this process, and I'll send it to you ahead of time. Everyone on February 2nd will actually get a chance to do the tuning protocol, and then I'll have really clear details about logistics and the number of copies that you should bring, so that we can, and I'll do the facilitation, and we'll have somebody else do another. We'll divide up so we can see what it feels like to be a facilitator of a tuning protocol, because once you start this creating a safe environment to get quality feedback, then it changes the burnout factor related to how hard teachers work and the results they see. Because the collaborative research done by Milbury McLaughlin and Joan Telbert at Stanford, where all the PLC research was from which it was taken, can show you how exhaustion and kind of mental fatigue is mitigated when you work with others in a collaborative environment. At the same time, and I'll send this out as a reminder again, on February 2nd is a rough draft of a written student profile using the WIDA student report, one boy and one girl from your actual class. Now, I just put some framing questions about what do you know about this student as a learner, family, community, culture, what student data are you using to adjust your instruction to support each student, and then how are you adjusting what you do for each student? Who will you ask for support? What progress do you see? How are they making their written work better? And we're focusing on written work because the whole goal in relationship to academic learning often focuses in most of the assessments, at least a third of the weighted assessment is on writing. And even though that will be different with the new assessment data approved by the state board, the goal still for us is to really focus on how language functions for the purpose ultimately of communication to a wide range of audiences and what that would look like. So that's a general review of what we've done, where we've been, where we're going. Webinar 3, I'm just focusing on key uses of WIDA and aligned to individual student reports on the USB Data Gateway. And I've talked a little bit about this. All that data is now uploaded so that each individual student has their report, which is also longitudinal, as well as a caveat and a disclaimer in relationship to comparisons because of the change in the calibration of the assessment, WIDA assessment. Now, the reason key uses is actually important is the key uses is determined by how language functions across content areas. So that goes back to the question is, how do we make grade level content accessible to a wide range of English learners? And for every grade level, there are WIDA key uses, and we'll talk about that in a minute, at uen.org. And all you have to do is put WIDA key uses, and for every single grade it'll come up. And this will be helpful for you in relationship to the way in which you use the individual student reports for students and how you can actually design instruction by using the key uses documents based on the 4 language uses. So it's kind of abstract, but I'm going to show you something specifically. So what are some of the examples of these? Are just some examples. So here are the key uses: recount, explain, argue, and discuss. Now, these 4 key uses of language is really about communicative purposes that are directly related to language and content learning. And this chart, I think, gives you some really simple definitions and then examples of what that would look like. And then we're going to go to an 8th grade student report from the USB-E Data Gateway, and then we're going to look at those key uses. I've only picked out recount, explain, and argue. You can look at discuss yourself. And then we're going to look at the learning tasks that would be aligned to supporting the student based on their assets that you see in their individual student report, and then what learning tasks you could design for the student in whatever subject it is, in relationship to supporting them in their achieving their next increase in growth toward language proficiency, English language proficiency. So the first one, the definition is to recount. So this also fits very clearly with DOK1 from the Hess Cognitive Rigor Matrix and many of the SAGE and then eventually the RISE examples or exemplars for questions in the assessment, end of level assessment. So it's to display knowledge or narrate experiences or events. So you're recounting. So some of the examples are state the steps to make something. Now you could use this and say, state the steps to complete a science experiment. State the steps in finding the area. You see? So this is a recounting of something that you learn. Describe experiences. So something has happened and you're describing those experiences. Order steps to get the answer. Again, you could look at this in relationship to developing kids' abilities to do sequences in a story, sequences in writing, without being so formulaic that, you know, it's not boring. And then produce information reports. So if you're producing an information report, you're recounting the information. See, so this is how language functions, oftentimes in multiple contexts, in classrooms specifically. The next one is explain. Now, the definition of this key use is to clarify the why or the how of ideas, actions, or phenomena. So you can see that this is a little bit more complex in relationship to a simple narration, but it's clarifying. So it's elaborating to explain. So one of the key issues here is, you know, who's the audience and what's the purpose? So if you look at examples, you have examined relationships among content-related ideas and concepts. So one might be an idea of growth, and it could be in biology. It could be in history in relationship to the growth of the United States based on different perspectives. Some people call it the westward expansion. Some people call it the eastward invasion. These kinds of relationships that are examined based on ideas and concepts that are specific to content show relationship between cause and effect. And many of the classroom observations that we've done over the last, I think, 6 months in different school districts, we've seen teachers at the elementary grade level really using multiple ways to help kids see the relationship between cause and effect and what that would actually mean. Could be in history, could be in photosynthesis, you know, It could be in the way in which you're writing something. It could be looking at a text and identifying. I did see one class in the Great Chicago Fire and having kids identify, based on this written version, what the cause was of the Great Chicago Fire. States consequences of behaviors, describe factors that contribute to events. So you see the explaining is clarifying why or how ideas, their actions or phenomena, right? So it crosses academic disciplines. I saw some really interesting math instruction that I think focuses also on, I think it was a third grade or fourth grade, they were working in teams, and as a consequence, there was a girl who was working in this group, and they were trying to explain how they solved a specific problem. And one of the things she did that was so really excellent for a young student was she said to the boy, well, I'm not sure that explains how you got your answer. And she went over and stood behind him and said, well, tell me why you think that. So that's an example of explaining reasoning in relationship to solving a problem. It's, a clarification of why this student had solved the problem in this way. Okay, so the next one is argued, and it's to persuade by making claims supported by evidence. I've seen lots of really interesting examples of this. If you look at the way they're using examples, it says state preferences or opinions. Now, ultimately, the question is, goes back to this idea of, if you're using evidence, what are the ways in which you identify that the evidence is valid or reliable, right? So I've seen teachers do amazing things where they present two pieces of evidence, a secondary source and a primary source, that has, kind of contrary viewpoints, and they get the kids to, this is in high school, to address why one is more valid than the other. So presenting claims supported by evidence, critiquing the reasoning of others, and giving reasons for a stance. The argue is a very sophisticated way of looking at reasoning at a metacognitive level. An example is one of the AVID procedures that I've seen done really well at Granite Park Junior High is POCs and the kids leading them, so point of confusion. When students are confused, they come in, and in a Socratic seminar approach, a student gets up. I saw one student get up, well, several. One student got up, and the question that they had, and the chalkboard was, or the whiteboard was divided into 3 sections, and it was about what's the question. One girl wrote, her question was, what is the difference between diffusion and osmosis, which was her point of confusion in relationship to a biology class she was taking. Another student was writing, what is the purpose, or what is the question of my report? And the kids were asking clarifying questions to help the students become clear about what kind of feedback they actually wanted on their point of confusion. Then the middle section was all the notes the student had written in relationship to the assignment they had been given. When they interacted at the very end, when they came up with their solution or a way forward in using evidence to support a claim, the last part was very metacognitive. It says it was about how did you get to this resolution? So it was a way to go back and look at the process they used to help the student clarify their confusion based on the content subject area specifically, whether it was biology or mathematics or writing an essay. So the next key use is discuss. Now, most of us are more familiar with discuss. The definition is to interact with others to build meaning and share knowledge. So an example is contribute ideas to a conversation, extend knowledge with a mentor, elaborate ideas with peers. Now, I've seen this happen effectively in several districts and several grade levels and several classrooms, where on the actual bulletin boards, they have sentence stems and discussion prompts that help students contribute their ideas to a conversation. One that I've seen consistently in an elementary school in Salt Lake was adding on. So, and it had a picture in every single classroom, add on, agree, and the other point was, disagree. And it was really focusing on the reasons for why the disagreement was based on evidence. Okay, so that's the definition and examples of each of those key uses. Okay, now let's look at an 8th grade report. Okay, so this student is an 8th grader. The WIDA performance definition proficiency level 4. And on the left-hand side, if you look at the performance definitions, it says that this student is at the 8th grade level, is doing this. This is the level 4 proficiency. A variety of sentences, sentence lengths, varying linguistic complexity and oral discourse of multiple related sentences and paragraphs. Specific or some technical language of content areas. So they're talking about a WIDA performance definition at a proficiency level 4. Now, how did the student get to a level 4? When you look at the bar graph, if we ask questions, we could say to the student, tell me what you're best at. And of course, the student would look at the score and they'd say, well, I'm the best at listening. And then you'd say, well, what do you have to work on? And the student would say, based on the bar graph, I would have to work on reading. Now, the reason this is important is that listening and reading are receptive language skills. And speaking and writing are expressive language skills. So we've talked about this a little bit before, but the reason this is important is once you go to the key WIDA uses and you see the level 4, which is expanding, and you want the student to move to a level 5, then there are certain lesson tasks, learning tasks, related to the WIDA key uses. So I'm going to show you how that works. Okay, so here's the students. Okay, so if you look at this, the lowest is reading, which at some level you would think seems strange because their listening is so high. When you create listening experiences connecting to reading for a purpose, listening for a purpose, reading for a purpose, it changes the environment in which the learner is understanding or comprehending so that they can talk about it, which is the whole point of teaching academic conversations, using the academic vocabulary, and then writing about what they have discussed, what they've talked about, what they've argued about, what they've recounted, what they've explained. You see, so these are the uses that then function as a way to develop literacy skills, which if you can see, the reading and writing are the lowest scores, the reading being the lowest. Okay, so let's look at the language domain, the can-do. Now, the reason focusing on the language domain and the can-do scripters is the fact that this is the assets. This is what the student can do, right, in reading, speaking, and writing. Now, if you notice, the reading, speaking, and writing is all about level 3, which is developing. Now, the advantage for this student is that their listening skill is a level 6, which means They can discriminate among multiple genres that's read orally. They can evaluate the intention of speeches and speech, right? The actual intent of speech, and act accordingly. So if you can evaluate the intent of speech, then it means that you understand contextual clues based on oral language. You can make inferences from grade level text, read alouds. So this is a pretty high level of kids' ability, but it doesn't necessarily translate to the written text, to either reading or writing or even speaking about their abilities in listening. Use oral information to accomplish grade level tasks. So look, there's no reason why this student isn't doing rigorous grade level work. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, so if you look at what they can do, level 3, you're going to focus on reading, answer questions about explicit information in the text, differentiate between fact and opinion, identify multiple meanings of words in the context, identify topic sentences mean ideas, make predictions based on illustrated text, use context clues. Okay, so they can do all these things in reading. Now, we're going to look at the way in which we can use what we know about their assets and what their individual reports would look like, okay? And I'll do that in about, I think we'll just spend maybe about 10 or 15 minutes on this. Okay, and this is the longitudinal data, and you see that the student was here in 2016, but the 2016-17 cannot be compared because the proficiency level was reset to focus on college and career readiness. And so you can't really compare them. So key uses learning tasks to support increased reading comprehension by, so this is what we're doing. What we're doing is we're looking at the learning tasks in the WIDA key uses documents on the UEN website to support the increase in reading comprehension by doing what? Capitalizing on her listening skill, because listening and reading are receptive language skills based on comprehension. It's how you support comprehension related to listening and reading for a purpose. Okay, now remember, in listening and speaking, you remember that in listening, she's a 6, but we're looking at the WIDA key uses. So we're looking at recount, and then we're looking at learning tasks of listening and speaking. Okay, so here's listening. So she can already do these things, but this is even more specific in relationship to when she's listening to something, categorizing details of content-related main ideas, seen or heard in videos and other technologies, sequencing a series of illustrated events from oral passages. So you can see this is listening. So she's recounting this, and remember, this is like a very, she has these skills already, right? This is bridging, but she's already, if you look at back here, right, she's at a level 6 of proficiency. Okay, now let's look at speaking. Now look, we go back to her scores in speaking. So it's a 3.9. Okay, now this is recounting, which is the key WIDA use. And this is what we would be focusing on. We'd be focusing on producing, or you could even start earlier, relating a series of events by expressing time in multiple tenses, connecting ideas in content-related discourse using transitions, paraphrasing and summarizing. So summarizing is really incredibly difficult because, which she should be good at, because she's very good at listening in relationship to multiple genres. That's what we saw one of her skills were. So using a text, maybe from, a short essay and something from history across disciplines, and having her identify the most important ideas and then talk about them so she could write about them. So recount, these are some of the things: tracing the evolution of literary characters, themes, plots, different venues, producing oral, multimedia, content-related reports based on research from multiple sources, which she would be good at, right? Because her skills of listening already. So the question is, how do you relate that to text that she's reading? Okay, so then let's look at recount through reading and writing, and this will give you another idea. Okay, so let's look at reading. We're actually helping her. Remember, she's on a level 3 in reading. Okay, so we're going to help her by having her do what? Through recounting. She's almost at a level 4, ordering paragraphs and narrative informational text, identifying summaries of the passages in a variety of genres. Because in listening, she can already do that. So she's already skillful in listening, and she can do these things, identifying things from context, using a variety of genres. She can do that. So now, the way in which we do the learning task is looking at different genres and then having her read for a purpose. And then what? So she's reading for a purpose, and then what is she doing? She's writing. Look, producing content-related reports, reproducing the sequence of events, producing research reports using multiple sources, summarizing conclusion reached from steps in problem solving and conducting experiments. And this goes across content areas. So she's recounting. This is the function of recounting that is less challenging than argue, right? So this is building up her capacity to use expressive language, which is speaking about what she's heard, right? And then reading for a clear purpose related to the task of talking about it and then writing about it. Okay, we're going to look at one more. I'm not going to do argue. Okay, so explain. Here's the next key use, is explain. Now, the reason explain is really important. It goes back to the WIDA key uses in relationship to why and how of ideas. And it's in listening and speaking. Now, remember, in listening, she's really great at that. Now we have to look at how we get her to use the listening in comprehension to speak about what it is that she's actually heard. Okay, so in the listening, you have carry out a series of oral directions to construct mathematical and scientific models, connecting details and main ideas on an extended oral discourse. So she's really good at doing these things, right? Because it's focused on her ability to listen for a purpose. Now let's look at speaking. Here's a task. Comparing content-related concepts, connecting ideas with supporting details to show relationships, characters' actions to their feelings. So this is kind of a literary example, explained by giving demonstration with step-by-step details, converting Fahrenheit to Celsius, evaluating the significance of events, people, or phenomenon in oral presentations. Okay, so the goal is to construct learning tasks connected to developing expressive language in the role of speaking about what she understands through her listening. So again, you see that listening and speaking are very connected. Receptive language listening, speaking expressive. And then the last one we'll look at is explain through learning task of reading and writing. Because remember, which is ironic, reading and writing is in some way the privileged domains because they're focused on what it means to be a literate person, reading and writing. And yet they're the most challenging. Now, the reason they're the most challenging oftentimes is because listening and speaking is not organized in a way that students use receptive language to then explain in writing or comprehend in reading, so they can talk about what they've heard, what they've read in relationship to their speaking. So this is the problem with lecture-oriented approaches to instruction. Yeah, it's listening, but how's that scaffolded so that students speak about what they've heard, right? So expressive language. And then how is it that we support the listening with reading in relationship to chunking it for reading for a purpose, not just in gaining factual information, but comparing texts, right? How is this different than this? What's the relationship between this or that? So these are the questions that are really challenging in relationship to designing instruction that moves from receptive language to literacy skills that are very connected to listening and speaking. But if you don't have the conditions for speaking or teaching academic conversations, it's very difficult to get to the writing, which is obviously the most challenging in any kind of career field, whether it's college or it's technical manuals or whatever it is, that the reading and writing is really critical in relationship to career and college. So let's look at explain. So here's reading and writing. Okay, so reading. Now remember, in her reading, she's developing. So she's at a level 3. So what are we looking at? We're looking at getting her to a level 4. Now, here's what the level 4 learning tasks are. Matching content-related cause to the effect in a graphically supported text. Highlighting text evidence that points to how systems function. So different forms of government would be one. You could do, the rain cycle. I saw this done really well in a science class. I think it was a 4th grade science class. So these are the kinds of tasks, and remember the tasks are writing, based on what? The key use of explaining. You're actually explaining. And she's at a level 3, developing, and what do you want to do? You want to move her to level 4 and level 5. See, sorting grade level text by highlighting elements of a genre. Sequencing events based on cause and effect. So all these learning tasks support her from moving from a level 3 to a level 4 in writing. Well, reading and then writing. Okay, so these are texts that she would be reading. And then here is explain again, but it's by writing. Describing the relationship between details or examples and supporting ideas. Connecting content-related themes or topics and main ideas. Producing informational text around graphs and charts. Comparing content-related ideas from multiple sources, essays, reports, and narratives. So again, these are the things that she's reading to move from a developing level of language proficiency to a higher level of proficiency. Okay, so in this session, we've only taken 2 key uses. We've taken recounting, and the second one is explaining. Argue, I've organized in pretty much the same way. I'm anxious to, in the next webinar, which I'm hoping will be either the end of December, probably the end of December, or the middle of December. And you'll have that as an opportunity to see an actual series, a text set that focuses on the student. So I'll use one example of that. I might use a second example of somebody who is a beginner, who's on a level, another WIDA score, maybe of an 8th grader, whose scores are different. The reason I'm focusing on 8th grade, and I'll just be really transparent about it, is that most of the research shows that if you have students who have been in our educational system since kindergarten, and they're not designated as English proficient, at least by the 5th or 6th grade, that the transition to middle school is very challenging. It's very challenging for them, as well as the transition from middle school to high school, where many kids are just end up being totally lost for lots of reasons. So, you know, those middle years are really important, especially in relationship to teaching academic conversations in the content area and doing it in a way that is really strategic and beneficial. And it just takes practice and then feedback based on what the kids are actually producing. So the question would be, you know, at the end of my lesson, or the end of the lesson, how have I used Recount and Explain to support students in accessing their receptive language skills? You can do it in recounting and explaining, so that their speaking supports the expressive language function of explaining, recounting, and explaining in writing. So we always want to make this connection between receptive skills and then expressive skills. Because remember, the goal is really to be literate in English and have access to grade level content. So I just want to thank you. I hope this has been helpful. I'll send out a survey so you can give me feedback on it. And then we'll talk about it the next session.